I would like to welcome you to the BSB Bookathon Winter Edition. It's day 3, and I am Melissa Brayden. I'm your moderator for this session, and I'm happy to be here. I have to pause for a second because we just said Winter Edition, and this is newsflash where I am and anybody in the South. We are experiencing some snow, which you might be noticing as well. So as I'm talking to you, I'm actually staring out the window at some of the first flurries I've seen in my hometown in quite a while. So diversion there, I had to stop and tell you. But we are excited to have you join us for these sessions. Without further ado, I want to get us started. We are here to talk about sidekicks. Those are the secondary characters that we love, or maybe even that we hate, just depending on how they were written or intended to be received. It might be the witty best friend. It might be the really knowledgeable police detective that our character is working with, or the meddlesome mom. Who knows? But I want to talk to these guys and see what their insights are on the topic. And I want to thank my panelists for being here. Rather than me reading off their bios and telling you about them, I wanted to hear from them. So I've asked them in advance if they would introduce themselves and just tell us who they are and what they do. I'm going to go to Georgia Beers first, who does Pilates on the floor with cats, and have her tell us a little bit about herself. Georgia.
Wasn't supposed to be with the cat. It just happened that way.
We don't know that.
I'm telling you that.
Sure.
My name is Georgia Beers. I write traditional contemporary romance. I've been doing it for a long time. It is my favorite thing to write. I love reading it. I have 16 Steps to Forever, which is out now, which was out last month, is my 27th book, which pains me to say. And it's just this whole community has been amazing. I'm so happy to be working and writing and reading and just making friends in this community. I'm so glad you guys are all here.
Awesome. Well, we're happy you're here on the panel with us. And I'm going to go next to JD Wilburn. Please introduce yourself.
Hey, how's it going, you guys? I am from Southeast Texas. If you guys pick up my book, it's coming out February. It's called A Far Better Thing. It is actually based in the city of Galveston, which is right next to where I live. The weather right now is not quite snowy, but it is definitely cold and rainy. So I feel like that's unfair, because if it's going to be cold, I should definitely get snow. I actually work full time in armored transport. So I like to say that my job is to put on a mask, put on a gun, grab a bag, and go into a bank and say, "Give me your money." So
all right. That makes for an eventful daytime, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And then we have David Peterson. Please introduce yourself to us.
Sure. Happy Sunday. Happy afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Peterson. I live in Arizona with my husband and 2 cats and an outdoor cat who's adopted us that we named Marcel. And yeah, he's a cutie pie. I write historical murder mysteries. So they're all set in the 40s, except the 6th one, which is coming out next month, is a prequel, and that's set in 1937. So it's, I'm looking forward to that. It should be a lot of fun.
Awesome. And if you guys haven't heard David do a reading from his work, you're missing out, because he does a really great reading. So definitely tune in to his readings in the future. I can recommend for sure. Next, I'm going to move on to Susie Clark. And Susie, tell us all about yourself.
Well, hi everyone. I am a retired county health commissioner for public health, which I have to say that I'm very glad that I'm retired as of March of this past year. So it worked out well for me.
Yeah.
I'm a registered nurse, and I have been writing for about 4 years and have been with Bold Strokes for about 2 years now, a little over 2 years. I've got another book coming out actually right now. It just came out January 1st and will be released, all wide release on the 12th of this month, called Shadows of Steel. It's the 2nd book in the Shadow series. First one was Moon Shadow. I am married. My husband and I live here in Ohio. Actually, we have quite an event this year for John and I. We'll be celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary this year.
Wow! Congratulations!
Congratulations!
You know, for one who struggles with same-sex attraction, it's been quite a ride for me for 50 years. So thank you for that. I'm excited about it. We're going to celebrate all year. So he deserves that.
Definitely. That's awesome. And last but definitely not least is my good friend Jaycie Morrison. Would you tell our viewers who you are and what you write?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Jaycie Morrison. I am a transplant from Texas to Colorado. We've been here about 1.5 years, and our wildlife is indeed wild out here. So we've got a bunch of wild turkeys and deer, and those have been our soap operas that we've been watching through the pandemic. They've kept us going. But I have a historical romance series called the Love and Courage series, and my new release called The Found Jar is a standalone contemporary romance. So if it's cold where you are and you want a beach read, I got that for you.
That sounds awesome. I love the title, The Found Jar. That when I saw it online, it immediately caught my attention, and I thought that's a great title for a book. So kudos on that. I look forward to it. We got to get down to it, guys. I got a lot of questions, and I'm confident that those who are joining us have some of their own. Once again, just a reminder to drop them in the Q&A box, but I'm going to get us started. And I would like to talk about the nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts of these secondary characters, the sidekicks. What do you think, in your opinion, and this can be from a reader's perspective or even as a writer's perspective, are the elements that make a great secondary character? I'm going to go to Suzie first on this, and then we'll kind of rotate the question around to everyone.
Well, a couple things strike me. First of all, they have to be memorable, and they have to be, either physically have some type of really great physical attributes or emotional attributes that the reader will remember. They have to have an impact in some way.
So no fading into the background.
Right. Well, yeah. If they're going to be a really good secondary character, they have, the reader has to remember something about them.
Right. Very, very valid point. David, what would be your answer?
Well, definitely, I agree. They have to be memorable. They have to help move the plot along without overtaking it. I definitely think the writer can have a lot of fun with secondary characters, make them a bit more eccentric, like Dr. Watson to Holmes, or Karen Walker to Grace Adler and Lone Grace. They definitely have to be more than two-dimensional, and they have to have multiple sides to them too. So they have to be real, but they can certainly be a little eccentric.
Yeah, I think you pointed out there a fault that a lot of people can find in secondary characters if they're not as fleshed out, as they seem two-dimensional and they pale in comparison. So Georgia, I know that you're talking about book 27 or moving on to writing the big 3-0, right? So we lean on your experience a little bit. What do you think? And I'm sure you've been all over the board in terms of memorable characters or secondary characters that you've struggled to make pop. What are the elements that really make that character stand out?
Well, I think that when we talk about secondary character, my brain goes more to the sidekick, which is more the BFF. For me, the BFF's got to be, she's got to have the sense of humor. And I say she, it can be a he, because some of my books, the best friend has been a boy. But sense of humor, that's kind of where, when your main characters are in a sticky situation or getting really serious, I feel like the sidekick is there to lighten things up just a little bit so that it doesn't get too heavy. I also think that a lot of times your secondary character or your sidekick is going to be the voice of reason. They're going to ask the questions of the main character that the reader is asking. They're going to point things out to the main character that the reader says, hey, but what about this? And then the secondary character says to the main character, hey, what about this? So I kind of feel like the secondary character or the sidekick has a little, one of those baby Bjorn things on their back, and that's where the reader sits. And so the reader's on the back, you know what I mean? Looking over, like whispering in their ear and telling them what they need to know or what they need to do with the main character to get her or him to the love interest and over the obstacles and through the bumps and that kind of stuff.
Well, I don't think we're going to be able to get past that image now. The reader in a backpack baby Bjorn. Come on. Okay, but I do see your point. Like the sidekick being the one that's like the head knocker. Like, what are you thinking? Like, get it together.
You're so stupid. That was a stupid thing to do.
Yeah.
You made a dumb decision. Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid and important ingredient. Jaycie, what about you? What are your thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, I think the sidekick or the secondary character can be the funny one or the head knocker. I just think that she or he needs to be a little different from the main character. So if the main character is busy and outgoing, then maybe the sidekick is a little quieter and kind of wise and, slow down, take it easy, let's figure this out type of person. But whatever the case, they have to have their own, maybe not their own story, or at least not at first. Sometimes they end up in a sequel, right? I'm sure we'll talk about that. But they have to have their own flaws. They have to have a little tiny arc of their own. I think sometimes their own point of view, which is where they do the head knocking, I guess, too.
Yeah.
But I like to see them as well rounded as possible.
Mhm.
Yeah, I like that you pointed out the contrast to that main character being interesting. I'm also really digging your microphone headset because it's like a cross between Madonna and an air traffic controller. It's really
Why,
good.
thank you. I got it just for you,
I
just
think
for
it's
this
great.
panel.
Yeah, it makes me really happy. And then Jess, we're coming to you last. What can you add to the list of elements of the sidekick?
Well, for me, honestly, the best side characters are the ones that the more I read them in the story, the more I want to read their story. They're their own separate characters. And not only do they keep the main character grounded, like Georgia was saying,
Yeah.
they're the ones that say, hey, what are you doing? Have you thought about this? They're the reader's voice in the story, but they have their own backstory that really shines through without ever shining through. You can just you get that feeling that there's more to this character. Those are the best ones in my opinion, in my reading, that when I read a character that's not a main character, but I want them to be a main character in their own story, those are the ones that really shine through for me.
Yeah, as a reader, I completely identify with that. And I'm sure to you authors, you might have gotten an email on occasion saying, hey, when is so-and-so going to get their own story? Because the readers are really insightful at kind of picking out those gems of secondary characters and then ushering them to you to say, hey, this guy needs a story. So I bet you've experienced that. I do have a question from a viewer. So here we go, gear up. This is from a comp. When writing the perfect best friend, that's such a good listener, has the perfect advice for the protagonist on how to proceed with the problem she's dealing with, is a great sounding board, etc. Where do you draw inspiration from? Do you base those characters on friendships in your own life? Are they more aspirational creations of how one wishes human beings would be? So essentially, where is that coming from when the sidekick is just the catch-all best friend? Georgia, we'll go to you first.
Oh, that is a really good question, and I don't have a solid answer. I think the answer is going to be from a little bit of everywhere. I have a small group of core friends, and I probably pick a little bit of their qualities, a little bit from each one of them, and put them in my sidekicks. I also want them to be somebody who, the bottom line is that they love the main character and they know the main character. So I just try to create someone who, I don't even know how to say it. Almost like I like to use siblings sometimes as the sidekicks, because I feel like that's a good level of, or a good way to gauge how well the sidekick knows the main character. If you're a sibling, you know your siblings really well. You've grown up.
Like high context.
Yeah. So I think I get inspiration. I have 4 little sisters, so I get a little bit from them. I get a little bit from my friends. And then I think the rest, I mush it all together and kind of create what I want that particular character to have in a best friend. And I also think that it's important to have them have a flaw as well, at least a couple. Maybe they're always giving great advice, but their love life sucks, something like that. They can't be too perfect, but they also can't outshine the main character.
All right, you got to mess them up a little bit then.
Yeah.
All right. Jaycie, for you, where do you find your inspiration for your sidekicks, especially if they're the good ones, the helpful ones?
Yeah, I agree with the mushing thing that Georgia just said. I do have some really good close friends, and I'm blessed in that way. And sometimes the sidekick, the best friend, is kind of an assortment of their qualities. which is fun because you can take the best from everyone, right? Just ignore that little snide part that this one has and put in the other, but sometimes it's wishful thinking. Sometimes you wish you had that person who would have, knocked you on the head and said, oh, come on, you don't want to do that, So I think it's always a combination of all of the above, but I agree that they have to have flaws and they have to have, because your friends do. So if you're going to use them, that's got to be there too.
Yep, very valid points. Jess, what about you?
So for me, I actually 100% draw inspiration from my best friends. I can't even give another answer to that. I wish I could. I wish I could say that I just have this amazing imagination that comes up with awesome people and these awesome conversations, but I don't. My friends, I'm giving them all the credit. One of my characters is actually named after my best friend with her permission, and she's the one that I'm constantly using her as a sounding board, and the advice that she gives me, I tweak it to my main characters and her quirks, and I mean it's a combination of all of my best friends, and they're just, I couldn't ask for better best friends, and I couldn't write better best friends. So they are 100% where I get my inspiration from.
That was a great way to put it. It's making me really think through my friendships and value them. They're so important. I need to send flowers immediately. Susie, I'm going to come to you next and see if your answer is similar or if you draw inspiration elsewhere.
Well, yeah, it is very similar. I think for me, the inspiration for the characters, secondary characters especially, come from the story. I'll have a character in mind, but as the story develops, I realize, that's not going to work in this. And of course, that depends on the scene, what you're trying to do with the scene too. A lot of times, the scene is the one that dictates what kind of secondary characters should be in there to move the scene and the main characters forward. So it kind of depends on that. Of course, I'm like everyone else. I draw on the people that I've met and the people that I have in mind that have similar characteristics that I think need to have in those particular secondary characters. So, but mostly it's the story that kind of drives me to the secondary characters.
Yeah. Through that motivation, which makes a lot of sense, especially through that linear storytelling. David, what about you?
Oh, secondary characters. I love my secondary characters. And Verbena, which is one of my readers' favorites, and Oscar the cat. Those are two of my favorites, and my readers' favorites. And Verbena is actually a melting pot, believe it or not. If anybody is old enough to remember the Beverly Hillbillies, she's like a combination of Granny and Mrs. Drysdale mashed together. So that's kind of where her inspiration came from.
Yeah.
Oscar, he's a combination of our two cats, and Grant Riker is just a fantasy guy. And Mrs. Murphy, the downstairs neighbor over here, she's a combination of people I've met over the years. Ramona Barrington, which is my main character's Heath mother, is nothing like my mother. Gotta say that. He was definitely not inspired by my mother. She's kind of a pain in the neck, but she means well. So yeah, inspiration comes from all over, and definitely melting pot.
Well, David, I think you win the prize for best visual aids for answering the questions. I think that's clear. I think what's also clear across the board is all five of you kind of hinted at the fact that yes, real life does dictate art quite a bit, and it's a large influence. I want to dovetail a little bit off of something Susie said, which was about this scene really calling for who to send in and what character she's going to use, or what their motivations or elements of their personality will be. So my next question is, as an author, how do you decide when a secondary character is needed? And that speaks a little bit to function, I suppose. And so your answers might be quite all over the board, but I'd like to test it out and see. Jess, I'll go to you first. How do you know when to send them in off the bench?
So for me, I wrote this book with the intention of it being as realistic as possible. So my book is a crime novel at its heart. And one of the things that I knew going into it was that this was going to be as real, as dirty, as raw, and as painful as I could make it, and still get away with calling it a romance. And because of that, there was never a question as to whether or not there was going to be side characters or how important they were. So honestly, it's every single time that my main character has a moral dilemma, she's turning to her best friend, she's turning to her partner, she's turning to her sergeant, or she's turning to her dog, who, by the way, is probably the biggest side character in the whole book. I think she has more conversations with her dog than she does with anyone else. But yeah, it was never really a question of when they come in. It was always going to happen. It was really just a natural flow of, if there's an issue, they help her work it out.
All right. So a little bit of that voice of reason, the sounding board that we touched on before. Susie, how do you know when to send in the sidekick or the secondary character?
Yeah, I mentioned about scenes, and I think for me, it really is the scene that drives it. If I find that my main characters need something done, whatever that happens to be, and they need some help, it's going to be a secondary character that comes in some way to be able to help them resolve it or get them through that scene in a good way. I think that the secondary character, as far as their purpose, obviously, is to move the scene through and to move the story forward in some way, or some form or another. That's probably how I judge, is if they're not moving, if that scene's not moving forward, then and it's the main characters that are so involved, then it has to be a secondary character to come in to move them all the way through it.
All right, so definitely an assist on the story as well, not just on the plight of the main character. David, what is it that tells you who needs to be in that scene?
For me, since I write murder mysteries, it'd be a pretty sad murder mystery if it was just the one character, or the one character and the victim. So definitely, like Jess, there has to be secondary characters that are going to be clue givers, and obviously that got to have suspects and somebody that the main character can bounce his ideas off of, and propose theories both back and forth. So for me, I always need the secondary characters in the books, and some of them have carried through in every book, and some are introduced for just certain books. But it's got to be somebody, again, that's going to give balance, someone who motivates the main character, and definitely offers a little bit of comic relief too. I think that's always important. So,
very, very valid point. Jaycie, what's your perspective on the scene and when to use the secondaries?
Yeah, I agree. They help move the scene along. They act as a sounding board, and all that's really important to plot and to character. But I think it's also really fun when the secondary character can be like a foil to the main character, tell her something she doesn't want to hear, just something, yeah, just something to kind of shake her out of whatever she's in, and move it along in that way. So not just oh, you got to get out there and do it's, well, then just forget her. Watch the main character go, what? So I like that kind of change of it, but I think the other aspects are important as well and needed.
Georgia, function of a sidekick in the scene, go.
I think it's twofold for me. One is, as I'm writing, I always see it as a movie, and I think about, okay, if this is a movie, what's she going to do right now? She's going to call somebody. She's going to call her best friend. She's going to stop by. She needs to bounce this off of someone. But more than that, I also use it I use the sidekick as a craft tool, because sometimes it can be really boring when you have the main character doing exposition or thoughts and recapping and everything in her own head. But if you can make that into a conversation, then you can inform the reader, you can inject some humor, and you bring in another character. which also makes the main characters feel a little more realistic. Because, you know, as David said, it would be an awfully boring murder mystery if it was just the detective and the dead body. It would be a pretty boring romance if it was just the two love interests and nobody else in the world. So I think it helps shape the world. So I think if you're going along writing, or you're going along reading what you've already written, and it feels like something's missing, or it feels, I don't want to say unrealistic, but maybe a little flat, or like it's missing something, it might need another person. It might need another sounding board. It might need, I don't know who said it, but someone with an opposing view, someone to be the foil to your main character. So I think you have to go along and pay close attention and bring them in when they're needed.
Yeah, I think we can all identify a little bit from a reader's perspective of pouring through page after page of self-reflection from a character. And it's nice to liven it up a little bit with some action, and that can happen through dialogue or bouncing things off another person. I'm going to another viewer question next, if that's okay with you guys. Frederick says, how do you balance not letting your secondary character overshadow the main character in your novel? So that's the main question, but there is a secondary question tacked on. Or have you ever revised a secondary character and made them the main character? And so, yeah, I don't know if that's ever happened to you before, but we can check in and see. So first of all, how do you balance not letting the secondary character overshadow David?
For me, the main character is the detective. So he's always going to be the focus, and I write in first person. So he's always the one in charge. So that definitely keeps it centered on him. And none of the other characters are ever alone in the scene because it's written in first person. So Keith Barrington, the main character, is always present. So I think that definitely helps. It helps keep the other characters reined in a little bit.
And so that would mean that you haven't had to swap out your secondary and main before, because he was firmly in the driver's seat, sounds like.
Correct. Yeah.
All right. Susie, what about you? How do you keep those secondary guys in line so they don't steal the spotlight?
That for me, that is a great question. I worry about that because, when you don't want it to overpower your main character. So you get a sense for it. Obviously, if you find as an author and you're writing that your mind is taken into, your thoughts and your attention is taken in more to that secondary character, then that's a cue that you've written them too well at that particular point. You need to back them off. If they're taking away from the actual scene of the main character and they've now become the forefront, then that's kind of a cue for me that you need to back them off just a little bit. But it's hard though, because you develop some of these secondary characters and they just seem so great that you want to work. They're easy to write. Secondary characters are easy because you don't have to invest all that you do into a main character. So they're fun to write, and then you kind of can get carried away on it, but you have to just really kind of be careful.
Right, for sure. You could be a runaway fun train, but maybe not in the right direction.
Fun run, yeah. Fun run.
Jaycie, have you had the experience of having a secondary overshadow?
Not entirely, but it is tempting because they're fun. As Susie was saying, they get to be the snide one or the funny one or the whatever is different. So it's tempting to give them a lot of page time. And sometimes readers do relate better to the secondary character than they do to the main character, which I think makes it difficult to back down on them, but you have to, yeah. And I think it's almost like not a word count per se, but you just sort of look through on your second or third draft and go, this person is really pushy. I need to back them down a little bit. And it's also a sign that maybe you need to sparkle up your main character a little bit, get something going so that draws the reader back to them and keeps the secondary in the background. Not entirely, but enough.
Okay. Very insightful as well. So, Georgia, for you, have you ever had to, say, this is not your book, Jennifer, back down?
I think it can happen. I do agree with Jaycie that if your secondary character is more compelling than your main character, then your main character needs some work. It's not necessarily that you've overdone it with the secondary character, it's that you've not done it enough with your main character. I also feel that
Good point, by the way. Yes.
I also feel that the focus of your secondary character has to be on the main character. That's why they're there. And they can have tiny little subplots, but they shouldn't take the reader off on their own tangent. They're secondary. Now, that being said, if you're writing a series and you know that one of these secondary characters is going to get her own book down the line, it's a little trickier.
Breadcrumbs.
Yes, you have to sprinkle the breadcrumbs. You've got to keep her, your reader needs to know who she is. So that gets a little dicier, trying to make sure that she's there, but not taking up the spotlight. So it's a little bit of a dance, but it can be done. You just have to pay attention.
Pipe down, Jennifer. Yeah. And sorry, secondary question. Have you ever had to swap out? Have you ever said, hey, Jennifer's really cool. She's got to have the spotlight. Let's trade these people.
I have not had to do that. I mentioned this in another panel a day or two ago, that I did have an instance way back when I was writing Too Close to Touch. And there's your main characters of Kylie and Gretchen. And then there's a secondary character named Mick who had a thing for
like
Kylie.
Mick.
I know nobody likes Mick, but there was a point where my editor had to come back to me and say not to make Kylie and Mick's story more compelling than Kylie and Gretchen's story. And so I did have to tone Mick down a little bit because I think I felt sorry for her. And so
what were you thinking?
Well,
Mick
but then
versus Gretchen? What's wrong with you?
But then I fixed it, and now you hate Mick, and that's the way I wanted it to be. So there you go.
All right. Well, then you won out in the end. You did the right thing, I think.
Pipe down, Jennifer.
All right. And Jess, have you had that experience before where you had this chirpy little secondary that?
So it's funny that you phrase it like that. I'm sorry, dog hair. I'm working on the sequel to A Far Better Thing, and it's gonna be a direct continuation of the ending. Like there's almost no space between the ending of A Far Better Thing and the beginning of the sequel. And there is a secondary character that popped up that wasn't even supposed to have a name. He was supposed to be just a dude on an airplane. And the next thing I know, I've written 5,000 words because this guy can't shut his mouth. And he's just talking, and it's cracking me up as I'm writing. And so I had to tone it down a little bit, but I realized like this guy's got to be in the story. I can't not put him in the story.
He's that good.
He's that guy. He has to be in it. And it's so funny because there was literally a moment that I'm writing his interaction with one of the main characters. And I'm thinking to myself, this guy has to stop talking eventually. Like I can't let him overpower it. And instead of cutting off the conversation, I have my main character ask him a question about his family or something like that. And I literally face palmed. Like I slapped because I was like, I have to know what his family does, you know?
Now we're there.
And so instead of taking it out, I just had my character do the same thing. And she face palmed herself, and I had to actually like move it into her introspection. Like, why am I talking to this guy? Why? Yeah. I need to be focusing on the case. I shouldn't be. And I've never had that happen. And, you know, you hear people talking about characters taking on a life of their own. And my characters do that a little bit, but never as much as this guy did in the sequel. He just completely took over. And I think about it more than I probably should.
He made an impression on you.
He did. He's a secondary character, but I'm so interested to see where his story goes. So I know I'm gonna have to rein him in a little bit, definitely.
All right. So you didn't swap him out for main character, but he's haunting you daily. So he's there.
Yeah.
I want to switch a little bit to process for a moment, if we could. And Susie, I'll go to you on this. Are you somebody who spends time on character development questionnaires or character diaries or other exercises that really get you in the mind of the character? Or are you just writing them on the fly? And this speaks a little bit to whether you're plotting or pantsing in terms of character development. So what's your process, Susie?
It's probably not one particular thing. It's probably a combination. I spend when I start a story, I spend a lot of time walking. I live out in the country, and I'm blessed to be alone a lot out in the country. I mean, we have a lot of walking areas, so I walk a lot, and it kind of helps me think through generally what I want to do, and then the characters kind of come a little bit to me, and they kind of, you know how they do, they speak a little. I know it sounds like we sound like we're so weird. We speak a little bit to me, and kind of develops that way. Sometimes I do sit down after a little bit of the story and write out a little bit of what I think what I need those characters to do, the secondary characters. So it's probably a little combination of both, but mostly it's giving myself time to relax my mind and just let me think through and let those characters come to me. Does that make sense?
It sounds like that walk kind of opens the floodgates a little bit to that creative energy, which is great. In terms, Jaycie, of character development, do you have exercises you use, or you just go for it once that laptop's open?
I pretty much just go for it because I'm a big time pantser, but I will say that I often go back and kind of layer in details once I get to a certain point. If I realize I haven't developed something, even if it's a main character, but a secondary character for sure, sometimes they grow as the story develops, and I have to go back and layer in some extra stuff, even plot wise. That's true. I am familiar with the character diamond, and I use that sometimes when I'm ready to go through maybe the last time and just make sure that I've filled in all their blanks in my mind, if not actually on the page, just so that I've written them as well-rounded as I could.
Well, I think you make a valid point, because sometimes what's not on the page actually does wind up influencing and texturizing what's on the page. So
absolutely, yeah.
I'm sure that exercise goes a long way. Georgia, do you act out scenes with your characters in your living room to get to know them better? Do you do the exercises? How do we get these characters?
Well, I mean, I don't tell people this, but yes, there are entire plays. I carry out entire plays in my living room. No, I don't really outline the secondary characters. Sometimes I put them in expecting that they're going to be important later, and then they're not. In 16 Steps to Forever, for example, the very opening scene, Macy's, the person who she works for, Emily, is, and when I started to write the book, Emily was going to be Macy's best friend, and it just didn't work that way. And I ended up putting in somebody else to be your best friend. That happens a lot for me, because I try to make sure that I pepper the scenes with a realistic number of people. If they're at a store, there's going to be other people. There's going to be, if they're at a restaurant, there's other people, there's a waitress, so I try to do that. And then often one of those tertiary characters will become a secondary character.
You're auditioning them.
Yeah, exactly. If I don't have somebody already planned, and usually there's somebody already planned. Like I said earlier, often it's a sibling. But not always. Sometimes I'm just like, you know what? I need this person to be bigger. There needs to be more. There's more for this person to do.
You're hired. Yes.
Creating somebody new. They've already been in here. So let's just pull them into the spotlight for a little bit.
That's a great way to do it, I think, to really test out that chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
And Jess, I'm going to come to you next. What about the development phase?
Okay, that helps. I was going to say, you're going to have to repeat the question, because
yes, character development. Do you do a lot of exercises and things before you write, or are you're getting onto the writing right away?
Because on Twitter, I do a lot of my friends on Twitter are part of the writing community and the lesfic community. And I always see those exercises pop up, and as realistic as I try to make my characters, I can't tell you what Bo likes in her oatmeal. I don't know. So there is zero. Yeah, there is zero character development exercises. It's just like I said, minus that one secondary character. For the most part, I know exactly who they are going into it. I might not know their story, going into it, but as for who my characters are, I just know who they are as soon as they get on the page.
All right. I think now we need to know what Bo has for breakfast. So we're gonna
that's the question that always comes up. What is your character like in their oatmeal? What do they eat for breakfast?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I can tell you what she likes on her nachos because I put that in my book, but she never eats breakfast, you know?
Gotcha. So now we know. And David, in terms of developing those characters, what's your process?
I definitely plot it out. I'm more of a plotter and a researcher. I write backstories for all my characters. On my website, you can find the bios for the two main characters and also for Anne and Verbena. So it kind of breaks it down. And I obviously, because the characters carry forth from book to book, I try very hard to keep it consistent. So how many times has Anne and Verbena been married? What were the husbands' names? Where did Heath go to school? What did he study? What languages did he know? So that it's my tie keeps going crooked. So that it's consistent from book to book and also within the book. And also, as you alluded to, I like the backstories, even if they're not on the page. That gives me a sense of character and helps me develop the character to be a little bit more real. To know that Verbena married into money. She wasn't born into money. That she went to finishing school and married very young the first time. Those types of things, and that her first husband actually ended up being gay, which led to their first divorce and subsequent. That's a hard word to say. Subsequent marriages. So, yeah, I definitely plot it out, and I definitely keep track of all the details as much as I can. But
so, quick question, David: are you somebody who keeps track of like a series Bible that you can refer back to? And
yeah.
And well, I imagine with historical, even more so, those details are key for accuracy as well.
Oh yeah. I definitely try. I'm sure I make mistakes, but I definitely try to get the details as accurate as I can.
Good. I noticed in our Q&A box, we've gotten quite a few questions that are referencing when a secondary character is promoted to main character and then they get their own book. And some of the questions ask about, do you know going in that a secondary character will get their own book? When do you decide? So let's just talk about if you've done that before, or if it's something that you've never done that you would consider doing. Georgia, since you have, I know, had this in your history of writing, when do you know, hey, this guy's or this girl's getting their own book?
Well, obviously, if you're doing a series, you know ahead of time who's going from one book into their own book. Recently, in 16 Steps to Forever, there's a secondary character named Sasha Wolf, who is the main character of my Christmas novella that was in All I Want for Christmas. And that I knew ahead of time because I was asked. I didn't know who it was going to be. She came to me ahead of time, Sandy from Bold Strokes, and asked me if I would do a Christmas novella. And then she suggested that maybe I use a secondary character from the book that's also going to be released in the same month. And I thought that was a great idea, but I didn't know which character it was going to be. And I hadn't written the book yet. So as I went along writing, I found myself really liking Sasha a lot. And I would say probably about a third of the way through writing 16 Steps to Forever, I knew that she was going to be the one who got her novella. And then I had to be careful because you have to keep her in the story so that readers know who she is. But again, we go back to that whole, don't let her eclipse anything. This is not her story. We can't get into too much detail about her here.
Yeah.
But there has to be more detail about her than there is about other secondary characters. So that was a weird line to walk. But
so her spotlight had to be a little brighter. But
exactly.
But not too bright.
Correct.
Have you ever had this situation where you went back for a character and decided to write a book about them that you had never planned on, maybe due to popularity or reader request, anything like that?
I don't think I've done that. I will bring people in for cameos, kind of like you do. You bring them in and they get to pop in and then readers go, oh, hey, I remember her. But I don't know that I've brought anybody and given them their own book. I've gotten a lot of requests though, so I will not say that it's something I would never do. I get a lot of requests for Anna, who was in the Puppy Love series. She was, I don't even remember who she was, somebody's ex. She's the person I get asked about the most. Is Anna going to get her own book? Is Anna going to get her own book? Because she was kind of a villain, but not villain. Like you didn't like her in there, but she has her own story. And so I think that people are wondering what that story is. So never say never, maybe.
Okay. Susie, have you ever given a secondary character their own book, or would you consider it?
Well, I definitely would consider it. Actually, this series, the Shadow series, is a series of 3 books. In the 3rd book, it is a secondary character that takes over, which when I wrote the first book, I hadn't planned that at all. She has a very small part in the first book. Second book, it's a little bigger. 3rd book, obviously, she turns into one of the main characters. So it wasn't something that was planned. It just happened. I think a writer kind of knows when they get a secondary character that their background flourishes, that you know, you end up knowing them really well, then you've got a good idea and a good character for a book. And of course, they have to be interesting. There's nothing worse
That's true.
than a boring character.
Yeah.
So, it has to be someone that has a character that has a lot of potential to be able to turn into a main character. And I could easily see Catherine, who's the one who gets developed the most as a secondary character. I can easily see her going in and getting her own book because of her dynamics. Yeah.
Well, everyone be on the lookout for that. It could happen. You heard it here. David, will Oscar the cat be getting his own book?
Wouldn't that be an interesting book?
Yeah. Or Aunt Verbena. Yeah.
Aunt Verbena, it's funny because she started out as, in my very first book, she's been in every book. In the very first book, she had no line, she had no scene, she didn't even really appear, she was talked about. And she has developed to the point where in my new book, Death's Prelude.
Look at you go.
I want David.
Yeah, David, I want you to see.
I want David to do a Zoom training for the rest of us because he's got it.
And in my new book, Death's Prelude, Verbena actually moves way up front because it's a prequel. So she is actually one of the main characters. She is taking Heath, who's a recent college graduate, to England on the Queen Mary, and he meets Baron on board who gets invited to his estate in England, and hence has to solve the mystery. And he falls in love as well for the very first time, and all sorts of things happen. So Verbena's along for the ride the entire way. And it's mainly those two with a few other characters. So she definitely moves to the forefront. But for me, I always try to be careful with secondary characters. I always think of Rhoda and Mary Tyler Moore. Like, they spun off Rhoda, and they spun off Cloris Leachman and all these other characters, and never really measured up to the original Mary Tyler Moore show. So I like to keep my secondary characters as hopefully just supporting the main book.
Totally valid choice. We are super short on time, but I do want to get our last 2 panelists to answer briefly. Jaycie, would you ever promote a secondary character to main character?
Well, I did do the Love and Courage series, in which secondary characters, their love story moved in along with the main characters who carried through. So I have done that. The one that people ask me about a lot in the first book, Jo, never got her story. I was planning to bring her in around book 7, but the series didn't actually go that far. But maybe someday.
Never say never. And lastly, real quick, Jess, what about you? Any chance of that? Will that guy get his own book?
I don't know. I'm seriously considering it for him. So it's not that I've ever purposely gone in with a secondary character saying, yes, this character will get a book. It's actually the characters that kind of dip their head in and say, hey, I'm here for 5 seconds. I actually have 2 more books for sure that are going to be in this series. Both of the main characters from those books are featured very lightly for maybe 5 seconds. But in regards to an actual secondary character, the longer I think about it, there is a character in A Far Better Thing that I really, really, really want to know what her story is. And so she will most likely end up as a main character.
Okay. Well, you guys heard it here. I want to thank all of you who tuned in. You gave me so many great questions. We didn't even get to them all. We only made through half of mine. This is a hot topic, you guys, and I'm so glad that we got to delve into it. I want to thank our panelists who are fantastic. There's more Bookathon to come. Please tune in. Have a fantastic day and look at the snow. All right. Bye,
Thanks,
guys.
Melissa. Thank you,
Bye,
everybody.
guys.
Yeah.